Okay.
We're working. That's good. Let me turn on my learning gate over here. Record everything I do because I always do better at this. One of the most humbling experiences you will ever have in your life is watching yourself on film. I know they're recording it, but I don't care about that. I just want to review my mistakes later.
Which hopefully is part of getting better at what you do. Welcome, first and foremost. Thank you all for coming. I know it's late in sort of the second to last day here, and I appreciate the fact that people are still rolling in. Right, makes me feel good. I hope to make this worthy of your while. I want to tell you a little bit about myself, so you're not sitting there thinking, who's this guy and why does he have an opinion on any of this? I spent the last 26 years of my life helping organizations improve user experience and customer experience, okay, with all manner of products. That has usually been Fortune 100, Fortune 500 organizations, government organizations, mostly in the United States. Also worked with a couple very interesting startups, particularly most recently a healthcare startup. Largely, I mean, what I do is I deal with products, okay? When you think of a website, an enterprise system, an app, whatever it is, to me it's a product, okay? You're creating something that's going to be used by other people. And anytime you do that, that enterprise is sort of fraught with risk, right? Will people use it? Will they buy it? Will they reject it? Will they not do what they're supposed to do with it? Will the system not do what it's supposed to do? Any number of things. So I usually get a phone call when there's a problem with something. We're having a problem with the remote here. I ran my own firm for 10 years. I sold it in 2007 to an IT company. Hung out for a couple of years with them to try and help them establish a UX practice. Realized that I enjoyed working for myself a lot more than I did for other people. And went back to independent consulting in 2009. Everything that you're going to hear from me, okay, and anything I've ever shared with a client, quite frankly, comes from experience. Okay, it's certainly not because I'm standing up here as the smartest person in the room or in this field. All right, everything comes from experience, and if you do anything long enough, you have some successes, obviously, right? But you also get to experience some failures, and the failures, quite frankly, are what teach you the most. All right, so I consider myself very lucky to have been doing what I do for this long and to be in a position where I'm continuously learning. In that sense, my entire approach is, you've probably all heard the phrase, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. That's always been my approach. I think that's infinitely more valuable in these situations and in others. Okay, in anything that I'm doing, I want people to walk out with something that they feel like they can apply to what they're doing. Okay, clients, students, conference attendees, whatever it may be. I have a book that I'm going to shamelessly promote here for a second. It's coming out in May. It is all about the strategy part of creating anything. Okay, no matter what it is, no matter what type of product it is, the most risk lies at the beginning. Okay, in strategy, in answering the questions: why are we doing this? Okay, who's it for? What value is it going to provide? And how are we going to do it? So the book is all about that. It's about user research methods. It's about what questions you need to ask users and stakeholders, no matter what the project is, no matter what the product, okay, may be. There are 3 crucial questions that have to be asked. I also, this is sort of a precursor to tomorrow's workshop, which is a full-day requirements workshop. It's about how to generate more meaningful requirements, okay, for projects. Answering the right questions, solving the right problems. I talk about how to avoid scope creep, okay? Never-ending project scenario. All of you, I'm sure, have done project work. I'm sure you've been on projects that felt like they lasted forever, and the end was never anywhere in sight. All right, there's a reason that happens. There's several reasons that happens. And I talk a lot about that. How to eliminate last-minute requests and surprises. Another big part of this business, right? We've all dealt with it. There are ways around it. Okay, there are solutions. So that's what it's about. If you are interested, I'm offering a special deal to everyone who's attending. Just come up afterwards, give me your business card, or give me your email address, and when the book publishes in a few months, we'll send you a discount code. Thanks for indulging me. My essential premise for everything that I do, okay, is this. User experience is a value loop. The unfortunate part of the term is that user is in that phrase, okay, because it's about more than that. It's about delivering value, okay? The business needs to make or save money, right? The only way they can make or save money is if they're delivering something of value to users, right? People use something, they buy it. Efficiencies are gained, whatever. But it's a cycle, okay? You can't just please one side. That's not possible. Everything that I do when I'm asked to come in and improve a product lives here, in between those two things, okay? That's where value is. So the essential question for today is this, okay? How many of you have heard the phrase form follows function? How many of you ascribe to that in the work that you do? And you're allowed to be honest. Okay, there's really no right or wrong answer. All right, so the question is, does form follows function? Well, on the surface, it seems like it makes a lot of sense, right? The way something looks should be determined by its purpose. The two things sort of go hand in hand, right? In terms of user interface design, all right, in the world where I live most, it's typically applied like this. We're building software products. First, we gather the product's requirements from the client. And the reason that's in quotes is because, and I have to say this, requirements cannot be gathered. Right? There's no requirements tree outside this room where we can just go, oh, okay, that's what we need. We need one of these, one of these, one of these, one of these. They're generated, they're iterated, they're negotiated in a lot of cases. Okay, it's a lot more than that. So I hate that phrase. Regardless, once you've got requirements, then you determine the aesthetics of the UI based on those functional requirements, right? We know what we need, now we're going to give it a face. The problem is it's not that simple, all right? It sounds great on paper. What happens is, in all the time I've been doing this, okay, this approach where UI is based solely on function results in products that fail. Okay? They're not purchased, they're not used, and they do not deliver any ROI back to the organization, return on investment. Right? They don't do what they were supposed to do. Again, the reason I get phone calls is because a company has spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of pain in some cases developing something that's not being used. And if it's an internal system, it usually means they're bleeding money because they introduced it to save money. And now they've got a problem that's twice as bad as it was. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because the phrase form follows function has been co-opted, it's been misinterpreted, and most of all, I think it's been misapplied in a lot of ways. All right, so a lot of what I want to talk about today is how this has sort of been maligned in a way of, is everybody familiar with the game of telephone? Okay, one person says something to somebody else, and then that person says it to the next person, and it goes on down the chain. By the time it gets back to here, it's a completely different world. All right, and that's really a psychological experiment. Okay, it's a social experiment, but it proves true almost all the time. So, in order to understand how the form follows function principle really should be applied, we need to look at how it came to be in the first place. Okay, we need to sort of start at the start and how it became so misinterpreted. The origin of the phrase came from a guy named Sultan. He was an architect. Anyone familiar with him? No? Okay. He was a pretty intense guy. Okay. And this is how intense he was. This is a great quote, right? Just listen to this. It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human, of all things superhuman, of all true manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul, that the life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function. This is the law. Intense guy, right? His whole thing, all right, Sultan was essentially a rebel. In his time, technology, taste, economics, everything was changing sort of very rapidly, right? When he was around, the forms of buildings that were built in the late 19th century were essentially still based on what the Greeks and Romans had done, okay? Everyone in his mind was sort of just following tradition, right? We've always done it this way, so we're going to keep doing it this way. And he was an upstart. He said, no, I don't buy that. I don't think that's right. So his whole point was that a new form for buildings was needed, and that form should be derived from the function, from its purpose. right? We should be paying attention to how people will actually use this thing, this building, and we should design appropriately. It's a good idea. All right? He didn't believe that it should just be from historical precedent. The new form that he invented essentially became what we know as a skyscraper, okay? Modern steel buildings. Here's how this got passed on, okay? Frank Lloyd Wright, who I'm sure some of you know, interned with Sultan and then became his partner. His idea, he took what Sullivan did and he sort of changed it a little bit, right? His idea was that the two things should be one, should be joined, okay? That both of them were equally important, but they had to be integrated, okay? So, he took that idea and evolved it. And what came of that, the most famous application of this principle in his work is the Guggenheim Museum, okay? The spiral shape, as aesthetically wonderful as it is to look at inside and outside, the whole purpose was the fact that as people walked through, they could also view the art as they moved. Okay, very well thought out. Have any of you ever been there? Okay, I haven't either. I'm very continually upset about that fact every time I mention it. Anyway, so the whole point, okay, was an evolution of both things. Beautiful form and very solid function. Okay, it made perfect sense. So Wright sort of started us down the right path. But like in everything, okay, there are always extremists. And they sort of always find a way to bend things to their own needs. And that's kind of what happened here. There was a ripple effect. Okay, Lloyd Wright's work created sort of a bit of an avalanche. In 1908, an architect by the name of Adolf Loos proclaimed that architectural ornament was a crime. Crime, as in you should be punished, go to jail, you know. And it was a reaction, it was an overreaction to the extreme ornamentation that existed at the time. Okay. Another guy, modern architects such as Le Corbusier, I always get his name wrong, Walter Gropius, Miles van der Rohe, adopted both those things. Okay, they took ornament as a crime and form follows function, and they saw them as moral principles. Okay, and these were guys that thought much broader about the discipline of design. What I love about both these photos is they're both doing them. Right, these are very self-important individuals, right? Equally as intense. Modernism and architecture emerged from both of those things. Okay? The goal was to determine the form of a building solely from functional requirements. So we're inching towards this idea that function, you know, is more important than everything else, not traditional aesthetics. Walt Gropius, who was an architect, here's where it gets important. This is where the crossover is. Founded a group called the Bauhaus. Anybody familiar with the Bauhaus? How many? Yes? No? Okay, a couple. His whole thing was this. Architecture begins where engineering ends, which in a lot of ways is true. Okay. The Bauhaus was a multidisciplinary design school. Their idea was that all these forms of design, industrial design, art, typography, graphic design, photography, architecture, to them, design is design is design is design is design, which also happens to be what I believe. Okay, I think the principles are very, very similar across all the disciplines. Their entire thing was that form had to reflect the function of the product. All right, so they're continuing this idea, except now they're moving it into areas of visual art, graphic design. Okay, so communication and meaning should never be sacrificed in favor of visual design choices. Design, not decoration, which is also something that I find myself saying all the time. Okay? Things that look pretty are wonderful, but they also have to serve a purpose. These guys were sort of on the extreme end of that. So if there was an artistic device used in any of their work, its only purpose was to increase its utility, its use, right? Its usefulness. What's important about this is that the Bauhaus was the foundation for modern graphic design as we know it. Okay, the things that you see in user interfaces now all derive from this school. Okay, they really do. You can trace it all the way back. The connection between color and shape. Paul Klee and Wozniak Kandinsky came up with those principles. Clean, powerful typography. The rules that Herbert Bayer set have been true for hundreds of years. Okay, and they're still true in modern digital user interfaces. Spatial relationships, integration of shape, color, typography, which is essentially what visual design is. Okay, it's about balancing those things, and it's about making sure that they communicate. Right? So all these core principles, harmony, balance, rhythm, proportion, symmetry, synthesis, Joseph Albers, this all came from Bauhaus. The reason that's so important is because modern graphic design is the foundation of all user interface design. Okay? This book, Universal Principles of Design, I've been pushing this book to anyone who will listen for the last, 26 years I've been doing this, and probably longer than that. They're all time tested, and they have sort of never stopped being true. Okay? It's about how you think about what you do, as opposed to how you do it. Right? Strategic versus tactical. What you see in interfaces like Windows Metro, which I think the jury is very much out as to whether that's good, bad, or otherwise, it all comes from those principles. Everything, every single thing that you see, down to the worst Java interface you've ever seen in your life, the principles are there. Okay. What I want to talk to you about is there's a difference between the description, right, that goes along with form follows function, and looking at it as a prescription. Okay, meaning do this, work this way. Two very different things. And the difference is this. Okay, on the description side, the idea is that beauty results from purity of function, okay, not ornamentation. So the idea is to favor simplicity versus complexity. This derives from the belief, partly, that form follows function in nature, which is also highly debatable. Okay, there are good arguments on both sides of that fence. The prescriptive version is anything that's aesthetic in design, okay, should be secondary to functional considerations. And as such, this is the one that's gotten us into so much trouble. This is an absolute maxim. Function first, form second. Aesthetics are secondary. The problem with that is that human beings, all of us, are visual. And any behavioral psychologist or even clinical psychologist will tell you that the expectations that we have of things and how we make sense of our world starts visually. Okay? We make instant assumptions based on what we see. And what we do next has everything to do with the signals we get. Okay? Whether we click or tap or swipe or know what all that stuff does, starts with visual. If we don't understand what we see, that doesn't happen. Or it happens poorly. So in nature, if you follow the descriptive version, the idea is that variations in form allow some species to succeed, survive, flourish, right? Get to the top of the food chain. And because of competition for resources, some forms are more successful than others. Right? Makes sense. Whether you believe in evolution or not is kind of irrelevant. This is kind of the way this cycle works. When you're talking about product design, here's the parallel. Variations in the form of products are essentially competing for sales. Right? If you're putting products out there, you're in business. Okay? The ones whose variations and integrations of form and function, okay, the ones that are most appropriate and relevant to people, the ones that deliver valuable experiences, are the ones that succeed. Okay? The companies that rise to the top of the food chain, the Googles and Apples and Microsofts of the world, didn't get there by accident. All right? And they've certainly had peaks and valleys, right? But they've got something. They're delivering something that is appropriate, it's useful, it's relevant, it's valuable. Okay? So this is kind of the same principle. The prescriptive part is more about dogma. Okay? And that means prioritize functionality over all other design considerations, including usability, including ergonomics, including aesthetics. This is how this has been applied. All right? Insist that aesthetic considerations in design should be absolutely secondary to functional considerations. Now, I don't know if this sounds extreme to anybody in this room, but I will tell you that in the majority of organizations I consult with over the last at least 15 years, this is very prevalent. I don't know if any of you experience this, okay, but I certainly do. Routine. Because when it comes to designing and developing something, what happens is these teams are essentially asking the wrong questions about the work that they're doing. They're saying, what should be omitted? Okay, what should we get rid of? What is not useful here? What elements do not serve a function and therefore should be removed? That's an absolute grand, wide statement. And as I'm sure most of you know, nothing in software development of any kind is that simple. Okay, it isn't. The problem with prescriptions is that they treat symptoms and not problems. So if you take that to its logical conclusion, if the form of a design was ruled solely by its function, then every functional item would have one and only one design solution. Okay? One kind of button, one kind of form field, one kind of pull down, one kind of whatever it happens to be, right? We would be living in sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. All right? Okay? We're being extreme here, all right? I'm just trying to make a point. Every element would ultimately have the same design. That means if you were designing, any type of screen, this happens to be a website, right? There would be no reason for these colors, for this branding, to pick a very specific typeface, to consider imagery, and all these other things. Okay, websites would look like wireframes, essentially. Gray, utilitarian, functional. Before an object's form could be changed, it would have to serve a different function. And again, I know this sounds extreme, but I see this constantly, particularly in enterprise software. So reality check number one is this. Users are almost always frustrated and confused when they're confronted with things that strictly reflect function. And the reason for that is because design often happens, UI design in particular, according to what we call an implementation model. Okay? On one side of the fence, if you think about, put it this way, there's the system, okay, the machine, the code. There's a model of how all that works. On the other end of the spectrum, you have what's called a mental model. That reflects our understanding, what we expect in terms of how something should look, should behave, what we expect to happen. Design and development is a continuum, okay, across these two extremes. In the middle, what we build together is a representative model. Okay? It's what we create. When we're close to the implementation model, okay, we're sort of mimicking that behavior. A field for every data input, a button for every function, whatever it may be. If we get closer to what the user's mental model is, and what they understand, how they see the world, right, how they expect things to work, those types of products are typically adopted more widespread. They do better. They sell more, they achieve cost savings, they're raved about, whatever the case may be. So design is all about making sure that you get as close to this as humanly possible. And quite frankly, it's not always possible, right? Especially in very complex situations, it's hard. It's very hard to make all this complexity simple for people. And sometimes you can make it too simple as well. So the critical question that I think is good to focus on is this, okay? Do you need to know the mechanics of how something works in order to use it? When you're driving in your car, okay, you have a dashboard. There's a lot of information in front of you about how the car is operating, how it's working. You don't need to understand how all those systems work, okay? You need to know what you see, you need to know what it means to you, right? When you start your car, you don't need to fully understand how the ignition system works in order to do that, right? There's a reason you simply turn a key and the car starts. That's making the complex simple, okay? I realize that's a bit of an abstract metaphor, but software is no different. Software that follows the implementation model, apps that follow the implementation model, systems, sites, whatever, expose a lot of this inner working, okay, in that there's multiple steps, there's too many inputs, everything is all given at one time, because why? We need it all. When that happens, well, I skipped ahead of myself. The question is, why do we follow the prescription? Well, because quite frankly, it's easier to design software that follows the implementation model. That means you have a button for every function, you have a field for every input, you have a page for every step in a transaction. It's logical, okay? A dialogue for every code module. And understand something, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, all right? Designers, developers, front-end people, middle tier, logic folks, back-end database programmers, we're sort of all in the same boat. When you have a limited amount of time, okay, and budget and resources to do something, you have to make some hard choices, okay? And quite often, the choices that we're sort of forced to make wind up here. Because you can't do everything. You can't do everything to the degree that you would like to. However, it results in things, you know, that look like this, or this, where there's, okay, just too much input all at the same time. Okay, when what the person needs on this screen is actually this piece of information, and everything else is secondary to their current task. Okay, this is what I'm getting at. I'm not talking about making things beautiful. I'm talking about the integration of form and function means appropriateness, relevance. Okay, matches what the person expects to see and do at any given point in time. All right, here's another example. It's all just, it's data that's exposed, okay? And as much as, you know, Microsoft has been the same for a very long time. Okay, but in usability tests, we've seen a lot of evidence that this overwhelms a lot of people. And what they do is they use about 10% of what the software is actually capable of doing. All that other stuff is visible, it's up front, it's in your way, and you have to deal with it whether you want to or not. The way the brain works is even though my work is down here, I am constantly paying attention to this, whether I want to or not, being pulled. That causes fatigue, believe it or not. It's death by 1,000 cuts, okay? It happens very slowly, but it does cause fatigue. As users, we don't care how things work, okay? Our focus is largely on the experience, our expectation of that experience. The mental models that we have about how something is supposed to work allows us to predict what's going to happen. Okay? We have instant expectations. And when the UI sticks close to that mental model, then use is easier, because we don't have to think too hard, right? And when use is easier, that's when we buy, we download, we share, we promote, whatever the case may be. So reality check number 2 is that form really should be determined by success criteria, okay? Not by aesthetic preference and not by function, okay? I've worked with plenty of designers who have wonderfully aesthetically pleasing ideas or interesting ideas about how a UI should look, but they're way too far the other way, okay? People have to use this, and the UI doesn't mimic what's actually happening on the screen. By the same token, if we go too far in the other direction, we're too worried about getting all this functional stuff taken care of. Success is the gauge. Success is the only thing that matters. Will this work? Will it be used as we intend it to be used? Will we or our customers or whoever it is reap the benefit of using this? Okay? Outcome. The outcome matters more than anything else. So form is really a matter of focus, in my mind, in my opinion. It's about outcomes, right? Not features. Form follows function only works in situations where something only has one function. And the problem is, that's not true of anything. Okay? How many of you have ever picked up a screwdriver and used it for something else than turning a screw? Okay, last week, I'm hanging a mirror in my bathroom and I'm putting in wall anchors. And I'll admit this, I am too lazy to walk out to the garage and get my drill, but I have a screwdriver in my pocket. And it just so happens that it's just about 1/4 inch in diameter, and it makes a beautiful hole for the anchor. Okay, that's convenience, and convenience will trump best practice every single time. Okay, there are plenty of things that we don't use the way they're designed to be used, and software is no different. One of the most amazing experiences I ever had that proves convenience trumps best practice is, as many times as I've sat in a usability lab where you're on the other side of the class and you're watching people use something, the things they do are astounding. Okay, just astounding. And you think to yourself, you would never believe it unless you saw it. Okay? where something is right in front of them, the core action is right in front of them, and they can't find it, or they ignore it, or they skip things altogether because they're like, you know what, that's too much work. And a lot of times they're mission critical functions, right? Internal systems in particular, like time and attendance systems, for example. People need to input critical data because there's no constraint that forces them to do so, they skip it. All right? And in one case, this is what the company depends on to do their monthly billing. All right? They cannot generate an invoice until they get all this information. So they're paying 3 people to hunt people down and get this information from. Okay? Simply because a good constraint wasn't in place to capture. All right? So you have to remember that. It's about convenience, it's about fulfillment. Okay? It's not just about functionality. If you're only asking for functional requirements, you're not asking the right questions. Those things matter, absolutely, don't get me wrong. But it's half the battle. Okay? The right questions, the most critical questions, especially at the outset of a project, are what does success look like? Okay? This book that I wrote, the entire book is based on asking the question why, because it's the first thing I do in any situation when I'm called in to help somebody. Well, we did this. Why? Why did you do it that way? What led you to believe that this was the best solution? And 9 times out of 10, you get a blank stare. You get a room full of people, and nobody took a step back and said, why are we doing this? Why does it matter to you? All right? What do people need most, and why? What do business stakeholders, the business as a whole, need most, and why? Where are the overlaps, the sweet spots? All right? I showed you this diagram at the beginning. If this stuff isn't considered, right, up front, early on, we're all working blindly. Okay, a lot of times organizations, the bigger they are, the more true this becomes. They don't necessarily know what problems they're solving, and they don't necessarily have a shared vision or a vision at all of what success looks like. And a lot of times those success metrics have something to do with things that are outside the realm of the software itself. Okay? For instance, we're developing an e-commerce app. Great. Should it also drive people to the physical store? In one case that I walked into, the answer was yes. In fact, that was the biggest reason for doing it. But there was no aspect of what was designed or built that addressed this need. Should a time and attendance system reduce our billing effort? Time and cost. That's the right question. What is this supposed to do for us? Should the redesigned bookstore website increase the number of titles each unique visitor purchases? That's very specific. It's a goal. These types of things greatly influence both form and function, and they should. And a lot of times, this is the stuff that gets left out of not just requirements processes, but the design process as a whole. Okay? Is the real purpose of the blog to generate passive income via ads? Whatever it is. So I'm trying to break this down to the simplest thing you can imagine, right? There's always additional purposes. There's always additional things that don't necessarily surface. So it's about asking the right questions. What aspects of this design, features, functions, form, what's critical to success? What matters most? We can do lots of stuff. What matters most? Especially when time or resources are limited, what design trade-offs would least harm the design success? I've seen plenty of situations where the UI stuff is first on the chopping block. Okay? In some cases, that's warranted. In some cases, it isn't. Okay? I've been on several big data projects in the last 12 months where it was absolutely mission critical. And the UI part, visualizing all this complex data, was left off completely. Right? And they put it out in a very obtuse, very dense, very difficult to parse way. And customers unanimously were extraordinarily angry. This is a $2.3 billion organization. In the 6 months that followed launch, they lost 6% of their clients. And that number to date, okay, as of about 4 days ago, is now 13%. And they are scrambling to make it work. Okay, so it's easy to say, well, look, we don't have the time or the money for this, something's got to give. Well, okay, we're not gonna do the UI stuff. The problem is, in that particular situation, and this is not a blanket statement, it's not always this way, but in that situation, There was nothing more critical than the ability for people to understand what they see and act on it. And when they couldn't do that, we got very upset. Right? So what's going to hurt us least? That's the stuff you don't do on either the form or the function side. Right? Both aesthetics and functionality to differing degrees have to be compromised. It can't always just be one or the other. And it has to be based on, again, what's successful. So what visually communicates value? Well, form follows function might dictate that all enterprise systems should look the same, which most of them do, quite honestly. Or that all UI should look the same, despite audience, despite subject matter, despite data differences, whatever the case may be. You wouldn't design a first-person game and a financial management system or application to look the same, right? They're two completely different animals. One looks like this, and one may look more like this. And in some cases, right, this is a new trend, less is more, flat design. And even in some cases, this is far too simplistic, okay, for most people's use. Again, it's about being appropriate, okay? Where's the balance? What's success? What do people have to be able to do with this? So reality check number 3 is that function is only a single, isolated aspect of what truly drives and influences form. Okay, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the sole driver. What really drives it, okay, is multiple forces. Audience needs, client desires, ethical obligations, right, what you're bound to do, aesthetic inclinations, which are always at play whether you want them to be or not, technology constraints, limitations, cultural presuppositions, functional requirements, material properties, what we're working with, the available time we have, the available budget we have, the available resources we have, people. All these things together have a profound impact on form. So not considering all of them in a design process, in a UI design process, is to get you into trouble. That's what leads you to say, we can't do this. Go on. Right? It all has to be considered. So what really happens is that form is the result of an elaborate balancing act. Mother Annalise said this a million years ago, but it's very true. Every force involves form. Every force at play in a project that you're working on, right? From your team, to the client, to the customers, to the realities of UI design, information architecture, front-end stuff, middle-tier logic, back-end data structure, programming and processes, all of it together. All that stuff I just showed you on this slide, plus all this, it's all a balancing act. Every single one of those forces has an impact on what the final thing looks like. Right? So if you're not aware of those, what happens is, and especially if you have siloed teams, design is here, development is here, and nobody's talking to each other, which happens a lot. Designers in particular will go off and do their thing, right? And it's far too elaborate for anything. Why? Because they don't know about a lot of the constraints of this stuff. And they also haven't considered the other things. What's realistic? What can we really do based on reality? All right, so you can't use form follows function as a prescription. It doesn't work because pure function is rarely the most important factor of success. It's better, in my experience, to focus on the relative importance of both things, right? When you're making design decisions, that criteria, all those things we just talked about, should inform the balance between the two things, right? These are trade-offs. They're strategic trade-offs. You have to remember that every force involves form, okay? The trade-offs you make mean you have to be flexible. And you have to consider how every one of those decisions, do it, don't do it, affect your chances of success, right? That's the ultimate metric. So, in my mind, we should allow the descriptive interpretation of form follows function to guide our efforts. That means it's an aesthetic guide, okay? Objects with different functions should also look different aesthetically, right? If a component does something different than something else, then it should have a unique visual description, right? Beauty can and does come from function. A gaming app should look like an enterprise system, right? A boat should look like a magazine. Each thing has a different function, and that function helps define what makes it successful. Okay, so we're not leaning on one side or the other. It's both things. It's balance. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and then I'm happy to answer questions if we have time, is this. And this is a slide where I pick on designers in particular, okay? But we're all, to some degree, tasked with user interface. There are two kinds. There are those who apply time and battle-tested principles, okay, that are filtered through discipline, through research, through experience, to their work, okay, and use that to determine the appropriate balance between all the things we've talked about. And then there are those who lean on famous quotes in order to justify their bullshit, okay? Form follows function, in my mind, and what I've seen, is often an excuse for being sloppy, okay? It's an excuse for not considering how people are going to use what we're building. You know, well, why is all this on the screen at one time? Well, it's form follows function. No, it isn't. It isn't. Okay? You don't want to be this guy. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you very much. Thoughts, opinions, questions?
So, what situation you don't really have a designer? Yeah, you've just got essentially IT and you've got users.
Well, that never happens, right?
Yeah. And so this is specifically on internal applications, you're not selling it into the market.
Right.
So the user in that situation, they know what they're asking. They think they know what they're asking for, and they've used various line of business apps before in the past. And when they are thinking about what they need, they cannot do it without thinking of what they want to see on the screen.
That's right.
Yeah. So what do you do in that situation? So they're already designing, and they expect it to be, what here in this, a table there for some data.
Yes.
So.
There are three categories, okay? Part of tomorrow's workshop is about requirements, okay? There are three kinds. There are things that people say they need, there are things they actually need, and then there are things that they don't know they need. The hardest part about all of this is what you just described, okay? Because you have people, and you're saying, okay, well, would you use this? And they go, yeah, and you roll it out, and it doesn't get any better. And you go, okay, well, that's what they said they wanted. The key to keeping people away from jumping to solutions, to saying, well, I want to see a screen that does this, a button that does this, and that would absolutely be it. You know why? Because that's not it. The key is asking very different questions, all right? And those questions usually have nothing to do with what's on the screen, right? The questions are, okay, walk me through how you complete this task, whatever it is. Forget about the system, forget about the screen, forget about what it looks like, what you press, I don't care. Tell me how you do it, right? And you let them talk you through it. The key, and there are other questions too, okay, but the key is you don't ever want to ask them specifically about what you're building. You want to find out what they do. You want to find out what they do before they do this, what they do while they do it, and what they do after they do it. If you leave the question open-ended, you'll hear some things that will surprise you. Okay? And you sort of push them to go into more detail. Okay, because they'll say, well, first I do this, and then, typically I get a quarter of the way through this and someone pops in my office and interrupts me about something, and then I have to do something else, and then when I come back to it, I have to remember where I was. And you know what I'm saying? The story gets richer when you leave it very open-ended. And it's a matter of getting as much of that information as you can from as many people as you can and reading between the lines. Almost always there would be something, there would be a common thread in those stories that show you where the problem is. And it's not what they would tell you if you asked them, what do you want to see on the screen? You know what I mean? That's getting into what do you actually need and what do you not know that you need. I do a lot of boxes and arrows at the beginning of every project. In fact, I spend a lot of time doing that because I want to see what the intended process is, and then I want to see how people are actually doing it. So if the intended process is point A to point B, what you usually find out when you do this kind of thing is that people go here and here and here and here and here and here and here, and then they come back here, do something else, and then finally they get to the end. And again, it can be mind-blowing. You're like, really? Why do you do all this extra work? But a lot of times it has nothing to do with the software. It has to do with their environment.
Sometimes people miss out some of the bits that they don't want to do anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to putting the system in, bits that are missed out that they actually really need.
When it comes to doing what?
So what you described there, so
Yeah.
what you hear, you start here, you want to get here, right? You want the simplest way in the world. But when you ask them to describe what that process is, they'll miss out some of the things that they actually do in the hope that they won't have to do that again, the system will magically,
Yeah, right.
tabulate the data in the way they want, or arrange it in the way
Sure.
they want. And what you end up with is something that, doesn't meet requirements.
Why not? Let me ask you this, are the requirements born from those questions? Or are they already set?
Well, the situation at the moment, I'm getting the phrase, doesn't meet the requirement, but the requirement is at as high level and broad as you can imagine.
Of course. Well, requirements have to be flexible, I'll tell you that. You don't know what you don't know. Okay? You don't know what you don't know. And the question becomes, when you hear all this, the question is, what can we reasonably do to mitigate this? And is it important to mitigate this, right? It may be a pain in the ass for them, but there may be no good way to solve it. All right? It has to be worth doing, right? Worth time and effort. If you say, well, okay, we can do that, but it's going to increase our budget and our time, tenfold. Or it's a black hole because we don't know how we're going to do that, right? So it's tough. It's very difficult, but it's the way to answer that is always the same. It's a lot of digging, and not everybody wants to do that work, quite frankly.
But do you think you should do the digging?
I think the team as a whole should do the digging. Okay, I think that means business analysts. It means project managers should be involved so that they know what's going on. If you have a product owner, they should absolutely be involved. Designers and developers should be involved. If you have people like me, to me, some of the biggest problems in organizations come because all these roles are working in a vacuum without each other. I want everybody in the same room. All right. When I go in to see a client, one of the first things I ask them on the phone when I talk to them is, who's going to be in the room for the first meeting? At least for the first meeting. And they say, well, our chief of this so it's all C-level executives, right? And I say, look, I don't mean any disrespect whatsoever, and it's important that you're there because you guys own the outcome of this. The team needs to be in the room, okay? The analysts, the designers, the developers, they all need to be in the room because they're responsible for creating the solution to this. And if you do not involve them, there's a whole lot of knowledge that they have that we don't. Okay? They can tell us more about what's going to work and what isn't than anyone in this building. All right? So to me, it has to be everybody. When people are off doing their own thing, you have massive disconnect all over the place. And that's a culture that I think is still sort of painfully changing. I mean, as great as agile and iterative methodologies are, there are still companies that are just not doing it right. It's this attachment to dogma, right? People, it's just like a form follows function thing, okay? My friend Sandra gave a great presentation yesterday about Agile in particular, right? About the attachment to dogma and tools and processes. And if you sort of bend anything, it becomes too narrow, right? To accomplish what you really need to accomplish. Other questions?
Kind of follows on from the last one.
Yeah.
How do you stop people insisting on wanting 20 columns in a grid?
How do I avoid what?
How do you stop people insisting on having 20 columns in a grid?
20 columns in a grid? That never happened. What do you mean? No, financial services and healthcare applications. Been there. The only way, okay, and it's not easy. It's not always easy to draw a straight line between these things. The only way to win that argument is if you can connect it, quite frankly, to dollars and cents in some way. All right, you have to make a connection between the person seeing this much information on the screen to here's what that's costing you, because the person has to wade through all that data before they can do their job. So sometimes it's time task completion, and if we can, we'll sort of force them to let us measure it for a period of time. Right? Because in a lot of internal enterprise systems, it's all about its processing and transaction, right? It's efficiency. And they do have metrics for a lot of that stuff. So if you dig in and you say, okay, here's the deal. I gave an example yesterday that I don't have in this deck. of a financial services screen. We talked to an analyst, and we came to find out that this screen was full of data. Okay, literally from top to bottom, just packed with, probably 16 different views of different parts of the organization's life insurance company. What we found out is that the group of analysts that this part of the app was specifically for needed 5 measures, 5 summary figures in order to do their job, in order to do 80% of the job they do every day. 5 figures, okay, versus a screen full of data. So we said, okay, this is a pie chart with summaries, and they dig in if they need the detail. And the way we won that argument is we figured out how much time people spend dealing with that freaking screen. And it was a lot of time. And when the suits saw the numbers, they had what I call a holy shit moment. Okay? Because they realized what it was costing them times, 1,000 agents or more than that. Otherwise, it's a very difficult conversation to have. It really is. You can't, and I say this to designers in particular all the time, because they always want to talk about aesthetics and design principles, and that's all wonderful. You've got to connect it to reality in some way, right? You can talk about users till the cows come home. You got to connect it to something that matters to the business, right? Otherwise, they're like, whatever, I don't care. Just do it. So I don't know if that helps you. It's not an easy answer. But you got to find a way to connect it to something that they care about. That's when they start listening. I'm lucky, okay? I get to walk in an organization and I'm not an employee, which means I can pretty much say whatever I want. But by the same token, I routinely tell them, look, you don't have to do anything I suggest. I don't have to live with the consequences of that. You do. Right? So, it's tough. I worked internally in organizations for a long time. It's not easy. Anybody else?
Well, what a situation that this is actually true. So there's a tool called Finland. It was actually, I was away from one of the two. It was actually a presentation that was just before this.
Oh yeah?
And that clearly follows the form function. It's exactly what it is, but it's extremely popular.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because there isn't a better alternative? A better alternative that was more?
I'd have to see it, quite honestly, to tell you.
But there is.
Who's it for? Who are the users?
Developers, potentially, testers, training.
Okay. Well, now here's something different, right? And this is a nuance that we didn't go into here. Developers in particular, right? Whether you're front end or all the way down to hardcore database guys, you all have a knack for complexity. Okay, you're able to deal with a lot of it. Okay, and you're able to make sense of it. Quite frankly, a lot faster and a lot easier than most of us. All right, that's part of it. Scientists, researchers. Okay, I've done some work in healthcare. When you talk to some of these physicians, right, especially the specialists, they'll tell you, in their world, it can be very different. They want to see everything up front right now. They don't want to drill down. They want to see it all. And very rarely do they ever want a broad view. Like they just know, I need to go, and I get it, and I know what it means. Here's the thing. A lot of that stuff isn't aesthetically pleasing at all, but it's ordered and grouped and structured in a way that makes sense to them. Remember we talked about mental models? Right? A mental model doesn't mean everything is beautifully spaced and perfect. It means it's relevant to the way you expect to see the world. All right? So if it's ordered and structured and labeled in a way that makes sense to them, the complexity isn't a problem. So that may be very true of this tool. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but quite often, I mean, you see things like that. Right? Like SharePoint, for example. I've been around SharePoint implementations for a long time, and some of them are good and some of them are horrible. And a lot of times companies spend a great deal of time and money customizing SharePoint, and nobody uses it. And the reason they don't use it is because it's one model for everybody. And in a large organization, people's skill levels and cognitive abilities, and I'm not picking on anybody, okay, but they're all over the place. These are all very different people. They understand things very differently. And sort of throwing a one-size-fits-all solution at them a lot of times just does not work. You got to find out what the lowest common denominator is here and you have to create a solution to that. You know, in a lot of cases, a simple custom intranet, old school, goes a lot further than a very robust platform. Because there are only 3 things people need to do. There are only 3 things that they're willing to do. I'll put it to you that way. All right, we could talk all day long about all the things we would gain if we could automate all these processes. If the human beings will not do it, it doesn't matter. Right? You're never going to get there. So it's all about appropriateness. Did I even answer your question? I don't know.
I'm just wondering how long that guy's going to ring the bell for.
Anybody hear anything today they disagree with?
I think there's certain times with certain news audiences where you have to do it in a way which makes sense to the way they think.
Absolutely.
So I agree with that. But for projects I'm working on, there's nothing to go on because there's nobody in charge of it.
Wow.
Well, it's a consulting project, so I'm done with the software. And so, even though it's a field I don't do anything with, so mass spectrometry, and I don't really know a great deal about that.
Yeah.
I have an interface which allows them to control the equipment and stuff like that, but there's no input about how to lay it out or what to do with it.
Why not?
Because
is there a structural reason? Or?
It's because all the consulting partners have their own areas to deal with, whether it's solid state pumps, whether it's the actual ionisation side, whether it's there's half a dozen different technologies, and they're just like, software will do this, but they don't say what to do is. They do their software on a tablet.
What about the people? What about the people who have to consume the data that run the equipment?
There aren't any yet because it's a European project, which means that it's done research.
Okay.
So they know that they want something to do this thing, which is basically to reduce the need on sniffer dogs at airports and places like that.
Yeah.
So they want a portable system to do it on. But there's a sort of target audience, but they have no particular type of audience in mind. It could be the people who handle dogs at the moment, it could be security guards, who knows? So
Very broad-based.
So it's very difficult to know quite what level to design it to, whether I should put hardware control on the front of it, whether I should be able to turn bits on and off,
Right.
or whether there should be a very simple interface which just said press the button there to do a scan. It's very, very difficult to know.
And in those situations, I think there's really only a couple options that you have, right? One is you look for historical precedents in something that's similar, right? And how people use, because it's machine control, right? And there are certain, and they're not many, okay, but there are probably certain constants in those instances. I'm thinking about manufacturing work, for example, done with all types of machine control. But the bigger, quite honestly, thing that's probably going to happen is if you can find a way to iterate with test groups and put skeleton versions of what you think this could be in front of people before you invest too much in it. Even if they're not exactly the right people, they're people, who maybe have some knowledge of what's going on. Sometimes that's all you got.
I'm trying, but it's not working at the moment.
Really? Nobody wants to be involved, or what
But
happens?
that's it, everyone got their own particular ways, and none of them know what the answer is. And none of them have an idea.
It's a hard place to be. You certainly have my sympathy. It's a tough place to be. At the end of the day, all you can do is, and in the absence of evidence, all you can do is take your best guess and hope that the penalty for being wrong is not astronomical. That's tough. And when you don't have an existing user base, you don't have anything to pull from. Like I said, all you've got is some basic sort of generic constants about what good control may be. All you can do is say, what are the most critical actions here? And make a judgment call based on all those things. I wish I had a good answer for it. But I don't. That's tough. Anybody else? Anything else? No? All right, well, I appreciate you all coming. Like I said, I know it's like, 4 o'clock end of the day. So I appreciate you showing up, and I hope you found this valuable in some way.